Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. This video is titled, Erasing America's Climate History. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration just released a report saying that this past summer was fourth hottest on record for the U.S. September 6, 2018, in a tie with 1934, the summer of 2018 ranked as the fourth hottest summer on record for the contiguous United States after 3 months of blistering temperatures. I've gotten very used to government agencies like NOAA and NASA lying about the climate, but this particular lie is particularly stunning for me. 1934 was the hottest and driest year on record in the United States. There were many heat waves that summer. The U.S. experienced unprecedented heat during May of 1934. In fact, there were temperatures close to 110 degrees recorded in the Midwest during May. Temperatures like that are completely inconceivable now. The May heat wave was the first of many that summer, and hundreds and really thousands of people died in the streets from the heat. Even the United States Environmental Protection Agency knows that the 1930s were extremely hot. They show incredible heat waves in 1930, 1931, 1934, and 1936. The summer of 1936 was actually hotter than the summer of 1934, but for the entire year, 1934 was hotter. And since the 1930s, the United States has not had any heat waves even close to what we had in the 1930s, which is why the claims made by NOAA that the U.S. was just as hot this summer as 1934 were absolutely stunning to me. The 1930s was a terrible decade. We had the Depression, fascism was rising in Europe, incredible heat waves in the United States, and we had the Dust Bowl. It was so hot and dry in the Great Plains during the 1930s that millions of people abandoned their homes and moved out to California. John Steinbeck wrote about this poignantly in The Grapes of Wrath. NOAA's counting on the fact that nobody under the age of 90 years old would remember this. I'm also under 90 years old, but the internet never forgets. This is the actual NOAA thermometer data for the United States. This graph shows the average summer afternoon temperature in the United States for every year from 1895 to the present. The end of the line right here represents summer 2018. The average summer afternoon temperature was below 86 degrees. This summer was more than 4 degrees cooler than 1936 and about 3 degrees cooler than 1934. It wasn't even close to being as hot as 1934 was, as NOAA claims. Note that summer afternoon temperatures in the United States have been trending downward since the 19th century, and this year was just about average. Let's go back and look at the NOAA claims again for a second. Fourth hottest summer on record in the United States, blistering temperatures tied with 1934. This is completely fraudulent. But I'm just scratching the surface so far. I'm going to show you now just how outrageous the NOAA lies are. This graph shows the summer percent of days above 100 degrees Fahrenheit at all United States Historical Climatology Network stations. There's about 1,218 of those stations. The data from those stations is maintained by NOAA and is the United States official climate record. This year, only about 4% of days were above 100 degrees in the United States, compared with 18% in 1936 and about 15% in 1934. NOAA's trying to claim that this summer was just as hot as that summer. The frequency of 100-degree days has been trending downwards in the United States since the 19th century, and this year was actually one of the lowest on record. Blistering heat? Hardly. And to make matters worse, this graph is actually somewhat inaccurate and skewed towards higher temperatures on the right. That's because they added Death Valley in 1960 and they added Needles, California in 1940. This pushes all the numbers upwards on the right side of the graph. If the data was done fairly, this number would be even lower. I think you're probably starting to understand now why the audacity of NOAA's lies were so stunning to me. Let's look now at a different graph. This one is the summer percent of stations to reach 100 degrees Fahrenheit sometime during the summer. This year, about 30% of the United States reached 100 degrees sometime during the summer. In 1936, it was almost 80%, and in 1934, it was more than 70%. NOAA is saying that this summer is just as hot as 1934. Look at the difference between them. It's mind-boggling that they could think they could get away with lies like that. I've got a lot of graphs in this presentation. I don't want your eyes to roll into the back of your head, so I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. This is the summer percent of days above 95 degrees. You can see that the 1930s were much hotter, and this year was one of the lowest. This graph is the percent of days above 90 degrees. Once again, the 1930s were much hotter, and this year was just about or below average. So now let's look at the trickery which NOAA is pulling to make their claims. This graph is the average summer nighttime temperature in the United States since 1895. You can see the nighttime temperatures have been going up, and that this year was actually the fourth highest in U.S. history. The average nighttime temperature in the U.S. this summer was 61 degrees. That doesn't sound blistering hot to me. So what's going on in the United States which is making afternoon temperatures decline in the summer and nighttime temperatures to increase? Well, that's pretty easy to explain. The United States is getting wetter. The United States had terrible droughts back in the 1930s. The desert gets really hot during the day because there's no soil moisture to keep the temperature down. The United States has gotten much wetter since the 19th century. This graph is from NOAA and it's contiguous United States precipitation. The trend line shows that there's been a large increase in precipitation in the United States since the 19th century. Having wetter soils means more vegetation. That means evaporative cooling during the day and warmer nights. The desert gets very hot during the day and very cold at night because there's so little soil moisture. Due to the increase in precipitation, we're having fewer droughts in the United States, and our temperature extremes both on the high side and the low side are getting smaller. In short, the climate in the United States is becoming less extreme. Now let's go back and look at the temperature graphs again. This graph is the average mean temperature, which is the average of daytime and nighttime temperatures in the United States during the summer back to 1895. Once again, you can see the 1930s was the hottest. 1901 was also extremely hot. This year was above average, but wasn't even in the top 10. And this summer was much cooler than 1934. Remember that NOAA is claiming we're the same temperature as 1934. Now I'm going to show you the fraud which they're engaging in to come up with that number. I made this graph using the NOAA United States Historical Climatology Network raw monthly data set. It's the average summer temperature, which means the average of daily maximums and daily minimums at all 1,218 stations. You see this is 1934, much hotter than this summer. But when NOAA releases the reports and their graphs to the public, this isn't the data set that they use. They use what they call a final data set where they tamper with the data, and this is it. Now you can see that 1934 is just about as hot as this summer. I'm going to go back and forth between them a few times so you can see how NOAA is tampering with the data. This is what the thermometers say. This is what they release to the public. Thermometers released to the public. Look what they did to 1934. This is what they released to the public, but the actual temperature is much higher. I'm going to go back and forth a few more times just so you can see the depth of their data tampering. Measured, released, measured, released. They're turning a 90-year-long cooling trend into a warming trend. This graph quantifies their data tampering. This is the average final temperature minus the average measured temperature. You see that temperatures from around 1900, they cool them about 1.5 degrees. And temperatures since the year 2000 are generally being warmed. If you're willing to do this kind of data tampering, you can of course generate any shape curve you want. Now let's look at how they're doing the data tampering. Every month, NOAA marks a certain percentage of their data with a capital E, which stands for estimated. This can be due to the fact that the station didn't report, or they thought they were suspicious about the data. But at any rate, what they do is they come up with an estimated number rather than the actual thermometer data. Around 1970, this was less than 10% of their monthly data. But that's been increasing in the last few years. It's skyrocketed. This summer, almost 50% of their data was marked with an E, estimated, which means it came from a computer model, not a thermometer. So that's where the warming trend came from. It came from estimated data. The actual thermometer data looks like this, cooling since around 1930. Note the similarity in the shape of the curve of the estimated data and their data tampering. This spike in their adjustments is primarily due to the fact that they're just faking a lot of data now. But the heat, drought, and misery of the 1930s was very real, and I think it's particularly awful how they're trying to erase this important part of American history. Now let's go back and look at the NOAA claims. Notice they said the Northeast broiled under record heat this summer. Let's see if that's true. This graph is the average summer afternoon temperature at all northeastern United States historical climatology network stations. You can see that the hottest summer in the Northeast was 1949, when summer afternoons averaged 84 degrees. This year was almost 4 degrees cooler than that, and not much above average. Northeastern summers warmed a lot from 1920 up to around 1940, but since then they've actually declined quite a bit. Now let's look at the percent of days above 90 degrees in the northeastern U.S. We can see that 1988 was by far the hottest summer. And if you remember, that was the year when James Hansen started the global warming scam in Congress on a very hot day in Washington, D.C. During the summer of 1988, almost 1 day out of 4 was above 90 degrees in the northeastern U.S. But this year it was less than 1 day out of 10. And generally the trend has been going down. The number of 90-degree days in the Northeast this year was just about average, and much less than many other years. How did NOAA describe that as being broiling hot? It was actually more on the cool side. There were relatively few 90-degree days in the Northeast this year, the exact opposite of broiling. NOAA does these mass adjustments to temperature which make absolutely no sense, but really if you want to understand the climate, you need to look at individual locations. The heat, drought, and dust of the 1930s was awful. Let's look at Martinsburg, West Virginia right now. The blue line in this graph is daily afternoon temperatures at Martinsburg, West Virginia from June through August of 1934. You can see it was really hot in 1934. The red line is this summer. You can see that this summer was much cooler than 1934. Almost all of the June and July days during 1934 were hotter than this year, and many of the days were about 20 degrees hotter. This graph is the average summer maximum temperature at Martinsburg, West Virginia from 1926 until this summer. In 1934, they averaged pretty close to 90 degrees during the summer. This year they were about 84 degrees, so they were about 6 degrees cooler. So when NOAA says that it's just as warm as 1934, it's simply not true. The 1930s were much hotter. This next graph shows the hottest daily maximum temperature. In 1936, Martinsburg reached 112 degrees. Compare that to this summer when they only got up to 95 degrees. So their hottest temperature this summer was 17 degrees cooler than 1936 and almost 10 degrees cooler than 1934. This graph is the number of days above 90 degrees during June through August at Martinsburg, West Virginia. In the 1930s, they averaged more than 50 days above 90 degrees. But this year, they only had 18 days above 90 degrees. That's a huge decrease. To say that this summer was just as hot as 1934 is flat out fraud. It wasn't even in the ballpark. There's nothing unusual about Martinsburg. This is fairly typical of stations in the Northeast. Now let's look at one in the Midwest. Well, the Midwest is even worse. This is daily maximum temperatures from June through August at Mount Vernon, Illinois. Blue line is 1934, red line is 2018. You see that 1934 was much, much hotter than this summer. It wasn't even close. Now let's look at the average summer maximum temperature at Mount Vernon, Illinois. See, back in the 1930s, it was really hot, and average summer temperatures have gone way down since then. The summer of 1936 was actually about 13 degrees hotter than this summer at Mount Vernon, Illinois. And you see that this year was one of the lowest on records. Mount Vernon's summer afternoon temperatures in 1934 were about 7 degrees warmer than this year, and NOAA's claiming they were about the same. It's complete lunacy. Now let's look at the hottest summer temperatures at Mount Vernon. In 1936, they got up to 114 degrees. This year, their hottest temperature was 93 degrees. The hottest temperatures being seen at Mount Vernon have plummeted over the last 80 to 90 years. They're not even close. Okay, one more graph, and I promise this is the last one. This is the number of days above 90 degrees during June, July, and August at Mount Vernon, Illinois. See, back in the 30s, they had a lot of days above 90 degrees. During the summer of 1901, Mount Vernon had an incredible 78 days over 90 degrees. They nearly repeated that in 1936, 1943, and 1934 was also incredibly hot. This year they only had 13 days above 90 degrees, compared to 78 in 1901. That's a phenomenal decline. Remember, they're saying that this summer right here was just as hot as 1934. It's a complete farce. It's a scientific hoax. So let's look at what else was going on in 1934 besides the heat and the depression. Well, there was this incredible drought across the United States. 80% of the United States was either in severe or extreme drought. It was completely unprecedented. The 1930s were hot, dry, and miserable. People were poor. Hitler and Mussolini were rising in Europe. And people in the United States, millions of them fled the Great Plains and moved off to be migrant farm workers in California. By erasing the extreme weather of the 1930s, NOAA is destroying our country's history. This is completely unacceptable. The 1930s was a very bad time for the world. The propaganda minister of the German National Socialist Workers' Party famously said, "I don't see why you should have the slightest difficulty in adjusting the trend of what you write to the interests of the state." Is that not exactly what NOAA is doing here? Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.